at the root of so many of our social and economic challenges. This link between effort and reward has become degraded over time. Until we put it back together, this won't be a country that is as inclined to feel aspirational, not because it can't, but because actually, it's classic motivational theory, effort and reward are linked.
Justine, welcome to the RSA. Wonderful to welcome you here.
Thanks for having me. It's an amazing place.
There's so much I need to talk to you about. But I wondered whether for our listeners we might start at the very beginning and a bit about your background. I know a bit about that, but
all right.
I'd love to hear. I know a lot of what you are working on now in some ways is rooted in those formative years. So I'd love to hear a bit more about that.
Okay. Well, I guess my journey starts, nobody picks their journey in a sense, but mine starts in Rotherham in the 80s in a really ordinary working class family. And I think when I was growing up in Rotherham, first of all, I had zero plan about politics. Nobody in my family was involved in politics, and yet it was a really political environment to grow up in. I grew up during the miners' strikes, the steel strike. My dad was on strike for a bit, because everybody was. He lost his job at the end of it all, which is why they were on strike. My first economics lesson is me asking my dad why they're on strike, and he says, because we think we're going to lose our jobs. Why are you going to lose a job? Because we're not making any money. Why aren't you making any money? Because no one wants what we buy. Almost this first wave of what would be known as globalization. And for me, though, seeing it at a really personal level, I couldn't believe that my dad was going in to do something every day that other people didn't care about or value. I just found that I couldn't get my head around it. And I just saw this huge talent that he had wasted in front of my eyes, and I think made a promise to myself that that would never happen to me. But I think clearly, as I later discovered, it sort of stuck with me so much as a sense of absolute helplessness, frustration, unacceptability around it, that I think I was never actually able to, it's not that I want to move on from it, but I was never able to shake it off. And so I've almost spent a lifetime trying to fix that basic problem.
You know what, your personal story is so close to mine. I grew up slightly north from where you did, in West Yorkshire, but self-same. 1980s, deglobalised, deindustrialised Britain. That's why I got into economics.
And you saw that in your own family?
Yeah. On the doorstep. And luckily, my dad didn't lose his job, but lots of my friends' dads did, self-same reason. So, just on that episode then, that, looking back on that swathe of deindustrialisation that we saw across, well, I say northern Britain, large parts of the UK suffered from that. Wales certainly did, parts of the Midlands certainly did, parts of Scotland certainly did, parts of the northeast and northwest certainly did. Do you think that was just the inevitable tide of history? Globalisation was coming, and these were the casualties of that wave? Or could and should we have done things differently to provide more of a safety net come ladder for people like your dad and many, many, many others?
I don't think, so first of all, I think the change was almost certainly happening.
Yeah.
And that was my economics. This is why I became so fascinated by economics. And I ended up becoming an accountant by training. You have to make the numbers add up. And the big error, in a sense, was not confronting the challenges when they didn't. And I think what I was always, resentful of as a child, were the adults who'd found it all too hard to actually face reality. And if they'd done that, then maybe only half the people would have lost their jobs, rather than everyone, but at least half the people might not have lost their jobs had the steel industry in that case specialised earlier, found different niches around specialist alloys, etc. And so there was a bit of it that I blamed management for, bad strategy, uncompetitive, and that's the responsibility of people leading. There was a bit, I guess, I blamed the unions for not being prepared to kind of realise that they needed to work to save some of the roles through accepting change. And I think for government, probably with hindsight, although government, you know, and the Thatcher government clearly could see that change was going to happen, the issue was just, I mean, you know, way too little support and strategy around transition.
Yeah.
But also where it did happen, for example, like Nissan in the Northeast, the car industry, an example of how actually we were able to passport skills through into a really new sector that then, even today, is still there. So I think where I was growing up, which was South Yorkshire, there was nothing like that. And therefore, it's kind of almost hard to remember what it's like to live in a town where there is no paid work available at all. Yeah. You know, my dad ended up filling up vending machines because it was literally the first job that he could get that would pay money. But I think in other parts of the country, there was ultimately more of a strategic economic shift to new sectors. And I think that's the lesson, that you have to stay competitive, but economic shifts are going to continue to happen. We're in the midst of one on tech and AI, for example. I think there's another one around talent on hybrid working, and in a sense, business understanding what that means for talent. But you succeed by embracing them, harnessing them, and dealing with, if you like, the downsides, the threats, if you like. And I think what we also didn't really understand in the 1980s, which I think in a way is a surprise, or not a surprise, but I think we should have thought much more carefully about, was the social mobility aspect of this. And if you like, the systemic piece of what happens in communities when everyone loses their jobs. And I think that's probably why my brain has always worked in terms of systems and patterns, because I was growing up with somewhere where you could see how everything just interconnected and knocked on, and I just found that really interesting.
And the system shut down.
The system shut down, and I don't think I saw it for what it was at the time, because it was just my version of growing up. But later on, as I, you know, studied economics and then became a finance person and went into business, I could start to understand, if you like, and see not just what had happened, but maybe what might not have needed to happen, and if you like, the opportunities for businesses being more strategic when it comes to developing opportunities and transitioning them.
Just listen to you speak there. I mean, what's amazing in a way is that we are still 40 years on having a discussion around steel and the future thereof in this country. And in some ways, you know, much of what Donald Trump is now doing in the US is motivated by the plight of people like your dad.
We're left behind, you know, working class backgrounds, and to some extent white working class backgrounds.
So,
these are all communities where, you know, this link between effort and reward feels like it's completely broken. And that even if you see growth happening in the economy, it's growth that's benefiting other people, not you. And we grew up in an age where there wasn't social media. I think I had a sense that there were people getting a better start than me. But actually, I bought into this message that I heard from someone like Margaret Thatcher, that it was effort and reward, that if I worked hard, I could just add water strategy to my life. You know, I would be able to get places. And I totally bought into that and thought, that's exactly what I am willing to do what it takes to get places. I love seeing people like Richard Branson, you know, Shirley Conran, Anita Roddick popping up on TV, entrepreneurs. So I thought, this is the route for me. But today, how would I have felt? I think differently. I think today I would have felt a lot angrier, because I would have seen what opportunity was doing for other people who had it, right in my face every day. And I think that sense of dislocation from opportunity, I think, would have felt much more real. And actually, the worst thing is, it is more real.
Yeah.
There's no way we'd be living in our houses with our starts and, if you like, the lack of assets that our parents could give to us, zero assets in my case, probably yours, to get on the housing ladder, even if we were us today, and even if we were still both those first people to get to university and do well, get into there's no way I'd be going back to my home tonight. And again, that's what I think is at the root of so many of our social and economic challenges. This link between effort and reward has become degraded over time. Until we put it back together, this won't be a country that is as inclined to feel aspirational, not because it can't, but because actually, like, it's classic motivational theory, effort and reward are linked. We've seen a version of Britain that steadily decoupled those two things.
Yeah.
Without meaning to, but that is what's happened.
I want to come back to why that is, what's got in the way of generational progress, social mobility. But I mean, just underscoring your point there, Justine, when people talk, politicians and economists, about growth, you see, I can't think of a world of growth, a model of growth, that isn't about unlocking individual opportunity. Right?
I agree, totally.
If there isn't individual growth, how do you get communities growing, like in Rotherham or in Guiseley, where I grew up? And if communities aren't growing, how can nation states or regions ever grow? So the thing you say about this link between effort and opportunity having been severed is another way of saying the engine of growth has failed, individually, at the community level, and ultimately that shows up at the nation state level as well.
And maybe that's part of when you look at Britain's constant struggle to boost productivity. Maybe it's like swimming upstream,
right?
Because actually the tide against us has become harder as this link has been progressively broken. And I think it's been additionally challenging for us, maybe because we're in a service economy, so it's much more about human capital, maybe because economic success in the 21st century is more inextricably bound up in human capital than perhaps it was 50 years ago. If you're a society for whom that link is degraded, for whom, if you like, social stratification and that kind of social rigidity is more fixing people in, then strategically, economically, that's a bigger problem for you than it is for other societies where there's more fluidity. And so almost it's becoming a perfect storm. I think the final point to make is all the evidence suggests that this is a systemic problem, and therefore the way it works is that advantage accumulates over time and disadvantage accumulates over time. Of course, none of this happens overnight, but what you're seeing is a very slow, multi-generational playing out of that. And so some of the evidence is that if you think of a ladder to climb up, a ladder I climbed up, you climbed up, the middle rungs are starting to drop out for people.
So the bottom ones as well, to be honest.
Well, the bottom ones were always hard to navigate up, but they are harder to climb up. But even people in the middle rungs, you know,
getting stuck.
They're getting stuck, and they're more likely. This is the risk. They're more likely to fall down than to move up. And so, almost over time, this issue that we'd have called, say, disadvantage, is actually something that more and more and more and more people think applies to them.
Which you see in real wages getting stuck for a couple of decades. You see it in, I don't know, a third of universal credit claimants being in work. You know, that's in some ways diagnostics on getting stuck on the wage ladder or the skills ladder. And I'll come back to you part of this story though, because you know, you are a shining success story on social mobility, given your background. I'd like to know a bit about, I'm sure everyone else would know a bit about, what were the secrets of your success, climbing the ladder in the way you did, from that working class girl in Rotherham to the highest offices of state. And then I want to flip it round and saying, from that vantage point, what's gone wrong?
Okay.
Why are there so few Justines around that we can point towards?
So I think for me, looking back on it now, and it's mainly as you get a bit further in your career and a bit older, you've got more time to reflect. I think I was, for the reasons I talked about earlier, just incredibly single-mindedly driven in a way that maybe I didn't come across that many people who were so absolutely focused on making something of themselves. And I think maybe I've learned over time. I did loads of swimming when I was little, and you know, my dad used to take me swimming and I used to plough up and down the lanes, and I think that gave me a level of sheer bloody mindedness about keeping going. I learned over time that I was better at keeping going than most people I met, and that keeping going was one way that I could win, basically. So I think there was a sheer bloody mindedness, a lot of drive, a ton of hard work, and some lucky breaks occasionally that went in my favour. And I think all of those kind of like not getting fired a couple of times when I absolutely stepped out of line because I didn't have good advice. Yeah. You know, and I'm trying to make my way in a career where my mum and dad are 200 miles away in Rotherham, and you know, probably like you, I just didn't know anyone else from a business career. So who do I'm not going to ask my work colleagues. They'll tell everyone, won't they, if I've got questions. So probably should have done, I should have done a course. So I think it was just keeping going and never thinking about the destination too much, interestingly. I was always just trying to do the next step. Mm-hmm. And I think that's how I coped with where the destination might go. If you'd said to me I'd be this first comprehensive educator, Secretary of State for Education, I'd have thought that was an incredibly scary thing that I wouldn't have...
Never got started.
I wouldn't, I would have thought, I don't know about that. I better be careful.
Yeah.
So I think I just kept doing each step at a time. But then I think the big secret of success for me was steadily realising that it was the journey that was my advantage. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That it was everything I'd learned on the way that made me me, and that actually I was a better minister for all of these different experiences, for all of these different communities I'd been plonked in growing up in Rotherham, going to Southampton at university, going off to Switzerland for a couple of years to work, coming back to London to work, being in industry, being in different companies, then becoming part of a local Conservative association where you're flung in with people who are 60, 70, 80, and there was I in my 30s. And I think that it was the journey that ultimately I think was why I could have success, because I learnt from it and it built me and it gave me resilience. It taught me how to solve problems. And those are the things ultimately that I felt I was able to draw on every day. Yeah. And I think steadily there were times when I looked round a cabinet table or at others in Parliament and thought, yeah, I guess you haven't done that. And I'm only here because I can. And so in a sense that was where some of my confidence came from, and I kind of shook off any imposter syndrome and thought, no, I know I've earned the right to be here, and that's a really precious thing. Yeah. But not everyone else probably could definitively say that. I don't know.
I think it's very interesting that, that different lived experience was your superpower in a way.
I think so, yeah. I think so, and I think that's the message really, isn't it? That we should celebrate those journeys. Because genuinely they are people developing themselves, and that's what we want. And so a lot of my work now is, in a sense, supporting and working with business to develop the journeys, because that's how Britain does its journey. I mean, these things, as you said, Andy, all go together. More people, more opportunities, equals more success. And this issue of human resource and potential, it's just this unique resource in the world. It's the only resource I can think of where when you use it more, you build it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Virtually every other resource, when you use it, it's gone.
Yeah.
And you deplete it.
Yeah.
But that's not the case for us. And
Well,
so it's, all these things pushing you to focus more on developing potential, using it, and developing strategies to do that at scale.
And it is exactly as you say, that it's a resource that the more you use it, the greater the improvement. But that's true individually and collectively, of course.
Yeah, totally.
Because of the collateral benefits we get from being around colleagues who know things that we don't, especially early on in our careers. To your point earlier
And the
on.
motivation it gives you as well, just doing things as a group. I literally, last night, I went to St George's in Tooting and gave blood.
Right.
It was a brilliant experience.
Right.
Not just because I thought, well, I've only spent an hour doing it and this will help someone, but because I just saw how much of a part of something huge I was, of all these people completely different to me. The whole community was there, just all giving blood.
Yeah.
It was just phenomenal to think that this thing is happening right now. And so it was it's the second time I've done it. It was inspiring the first time and the second time, but I got so much from it. It's encouraged me to go again.
Yeah. Well, all the evidence on that, I mean, right in terms of what gives us satisfaction and well-being in life, whether it's giving money or time or blood in your case,
Yeah.
that gives you a massive boost, biologically as well as psychologically. You mentioned about, I want to come on to the role of business in creating those ladders of opportunity, which, like you, I think are absolutely foundational to individual well-being, but also to collective success and thriving. But having had a ringside seat on all matters education for a long time, is our current education system part of the solution, or has it become part of the problem?
Well, it's both, isn't it? It's part of the solution because actually I'd have got nowhere without my education. I mean, none of us would. And it's why I always said, A, it was my dream job, and B, I thought it was the most important job in government, because I think it is literally about lives on track and potential. And so it is foundational. It's part of the problem because it's where the gaps start, and our inability, in a sense, to, I think, confront, they're not hard choices, but confront the choices around that, is why it's, in a sense, it was also quite a frustrating job at times. I saw this at Diffid, but the thing about kids is they do grow up. And so we are taking a decision about their futures.
Yeah.
Whether or not we know it, realise it, or want to. And the decision is, are they going to grow up able to contribute, make the most of their potential, have a sense of their place in this world, have a lifelong love of learning that they can take into adulthood, or not? And I think for too long we've sort of fudged that. And I think there's been almost, I would argue, a complacency at times in government from too many, that somehow these gaps, well, they're just going to happen, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Like, that's just how it works. And I just think that's false. And so we were using the phrase levelling up, as you know. When I was at the DFE, it was my way of talking about social mobility. Yeah. And we were using the phrase, it's in the front of my social mobility action plan, I think it's paragraph 2, where I open up saying the problem with Britain is that talent spread evenly, but opportunity is not. But that was an important phrase for two reasons. One, it was the articulation, the very deliberate articulation of two halves of a social mobility strategy. Talent spread evenly, but not developed consistently in our education system. And opportunity is not. The fact that businesses are the opportunity creators, the opportunity holders, and therefore they have to be part of driving equality of opportunity. But the second reason it mattered, being absolutely frank, is You either believe that or you don't. You either believe that opportunity spread evenly, or that talent spread evenly, or you don't. And I think there are too many people in government for whom it was a wonderful bit of rhetoric that they picked up.
Right.
But deep down,
They're not true believers.
they don't really believe that talent is spread evenly. But I do.
Right.
And
You-
so
you-
for
you
me,
know.
absolutely.
You lived it.
Well,
And as
I've
do I.
lived it, you've
Yeah.
lived it. I think it's just the truth. But if you believe it's the truth, then it has to be a design principle for government.
Right.
And that surely starts with education and, no more strategies where we're going to halve a gap. Like, why would you halve a gap? It's literally the definition of half a strategy.
Right.
And I think it's those sort of leaps of ambition that you've got to see people in government start to take.
And you mentioned before about nurturing that love of learning, which I think is so important. I mean, it's always been important, of course, but particularly now where we'll have to make a reality of lifelong learning.
Yes.
And if you leave education loathing learning, you're far less likely to do it. And that, in some ways, would have lifelong implications then.
Yeah.
But we also know that there's a great many young people leaving our education system. Well, one leaving it early. I was speaking to a friend just the weekend, just been to Grimsby. 14-year-olds, 40% of 14-year-olds are basically out of school. 40, lost to learning at 14, 15, 16, and therefore unlikely, certainly with difficulty, would find a way back in.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't this a diagnostic on a system not working? For too many young people in the poorest parts of the country, there's many Grimsbys, regrettably, around the country.
I think it's the continued scarring of COVID.
Yeah.
No doubt about that.
Yeah.
And I think in the end, if there's a purpose of education for me, it's threefold. It's above all, perhaps, to give people the skills, the knowledge to connect up to opportunity, the advice, the insights to connect up to opportunity. It is that sense of a place in the world, and it is that joy of learning, because we know that they're going to have to keep on learning. But I think we haven't enabled the education system to be tailored for what we need in the 21st century. I mean, it's a rear view mirror on a version of Britain that doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, it's a version of Britain that has and had weak social mobility. So if you're looking at what you need to go forward, it's much more, it's less around stuffing your brain with facts. I can find those on Google now. So as much as I enjoyed doing University Challenge in the run up to Christmas, I was sat trying to answer the questions thinking, like, who cares though? I mean, who cares if who cares if they know it? Who cares if I don't know it?
Yeah.
Who cares if I know it?
Yeah.
The bottom line is that's not what intelligence is anymore. I mean, presumably having a brain stuffed full of facts, if it was, 1945, probably was quite handy. But now it's about, can you really synthesize? Can you see those connections? Can you problem solve? Can you work in those teams? What's the creativity that you bring? Are you able to kind of see those crossovers?
Yeah.
That's, if you like, what we have to teach people in the education system. So it's almost less of the stuff that they can now access everywhere else, and it's more of them developing their critical thinking, literally using the human intelligence they have. And to just briefly go back to government, I mean, surely it's crazy, isn't it, that when the Treasury, I think under the last government, announced £900 million of investment in AI, this is artificial intelligence, that scored on the nation's balance sheet as an asset.
Yeah.
Yet had we put the same amount into HI, human intelligence, this is the bit that creates the AI ultimately, then that would have just been a cost.
Yeah. I agree. That is one of the many deep perversities of the Treasury's Green Book.
Well, maybe it gets to the heart of, in a sense, how you need system change, because actually, if what you've got are these jigsaw pieces, you know, the key question I always used to ask as a Secretary of State, because of my kind of Peter Senge systems brain, was why have we reached this version of the status quo? Like, why doesn't it shift to what I want? Why is, say, an education in Grimsby at this level of status quo when I want to be up there? What are the kind of systemic pressures that keep it where it is?
So on that, I'm really interested in this. And as someone who's led a number of government departments, with distinction, Justine, you know, you could take any one of a number of our systems right now in this country: the health system, education system, innovation system, and everyone with a stake in that system agrees that where we are is not where we want us to be. Everyone's up for change. But of course, because they're up for often for subtly or sometimes not so subtly types of change, the result is basically stasis.
Yep.
Everyone wants change, but it's different sort of change, and the result is the status quo ante prevails. How do you, and you get stuck, systems get stuck, and everyone's unhappy with it, but they're all equally unhappy, and that's a recipe for inertia and stasis rather than change. How do you break free, you know, how do you break free of that? How do you lead that root and branch system change? I think most would agree is needed across some of the key pillars of our society right now.
I think, so first of all, I think you need a common purpose.
Yeah.
And it was interesting, wasn't it, during COVID? I could relate to it when I was in DFID and we had Ebola. Sometimes there are those things that have such a galvanising purpose that they are then able to give the system such a guiding purpose that it self-directs.
Yeah.
And as we saw in COVID, if you'd asked the government and local authorities to come up with COVID plans, they'd probably still be doing them now. But because it was such a burning platform, people just got on and were self-directed. So I think the problem for government often is we love structures. I don't love structures, but people in government love structures. And, you know, there'll always be a group of people who are, you know, doing things. But unless it's really clear about what that overriding purpose is, the risk is it's just a group of people doing the latest group. When I was at the DFE, one of the things that I did, I was going to say experimented with, because it was a pilot in a way, but it was me thinking, basically, how do I harness the system to change these equilibriums? So I did opportunity areas, and that was my hypothesis, was basically no one's going to care as much about improving education in a place like Rotherham as Rotherham.
Yeah.
And therefore, I have got to help the system itself in those local areas improve itself and galvanise itself. They'll be the ones most motivated. But they had this overriding purpose. And what was really fascinating, so in Blackpool, in Bradford, what was really fascinating was I did spend some time thinking, clearly part of the system change I need is businesses to do this, I probably need DWP to do that, I might need the NHS and Department of Health, maybe I should give Jeremy Hunter a shout and we could, and in the end, I thought, do I or not? Because I thought, if I do this, then I don't think these things are ever going to happen, because I'm just going to have a massive turf war across government around how these interlinked bits of departmental briefs, you know, who does what. I just thought I'm never going to even get them started. So I actively decided not to, and that's a negative comment on government. I shouldn't have reached the conclusion I did, but I'm a pragmatist. Yeah. And it was the right decision. I thought I'm just going to get on when I've got something, if you like, for other people to dock into, then, and if it works, it might not work. I thought, then I'll go back. And I might even talk to Treasury about tax incentives, I thought to myself, who knows? But anyway, I needn't have worried, because when I get these things going, I go to to Bradford and Blackpool, I go off to Ipswich, I get them all up and running. They're so motivated, they do all the local connections.
Yeah.
You know, in Bradford, they do think, oh, hang on a minute, we should definitely bring in the NHS, because maybe there's a thing, if we look at our numbers of kids going to the opticians rates, are they a bit below?
Right.
They do all that work. They end up realising that there's a statistically significant number of children who aren't getting the right glasses prescriptions. So they do this glasses for classes thing. In Bradford, it ends up with, I think, if not but like out of the ballpark rates of improved literacy on the back of literally improving children's eyesight.
Yeah.
All you needed to do, I say all, what you needed to do was allow them a common mission where they were then working out how to achieve it. It was supported by the DFE, so I had my officials embedded into those teams. And often, and for the most part, there were people who literally got in touch with my private office saying, oh, I grew up in Bradford or Norwich or what. I went to one of those schools. I'd love to be. A lot of the officials said, I'm happy to volunteer, to help out. So it was one team with one mission, one plan, which, Andy, I have to say, sometimes we had to bang heads together. I'd be like, look, you've got to agree. So if anyone's got any misgivings, we need those out on the table. Yeah. But they went through that, and they then were absolutely motoring, so much so that long after I'd stopped, long after several Secretary of State for Education had come and gone, they were still going. And the Stoke Opportunity Area charity arm that they set up is still raising money. During COVID, the networks that they'd created in both Bradford and Stoke were delivering lesson plans with food, because they recognised those families were going to have those dual issues. So, it's just, there's such good examples of how, with the right common purpose, you will get that more local tailoring.
Yeah.
Actually, we took the politics out of them, and I guess they didn't really need a devolution bill going through. It was just literally right people in the room with a mission, allowed to get on with it, and they did.
I think this is one of the most, although it isn't umbilically tied to devolution, in some ways it makes clear, I think, one of the biggest benefits of, if you like, decentralisation as distinct from devolution, which is, as you would know, and as I would know a bit, joining up the great Whitehall departments is a hell of a thing.
Well, you'll never get past the strategy stage, and I think Theresa May's industrial strategy spent 2 years being developed, and I think it only lasted.
I was a painful part of that
before Boris came or whatever.
Yeah.
So this is and also it's not top down, and I think what you need to recognise is
that's right. Yeah.
Social mobility in particular, social mobility cold spots aren't all the same, and they are different beasts. So the challenges faced by the North York coast, for example, on Opportunity, are quite different to rural Somerset, and therefore top-down structures
cannot work in that.
We should be surprised if a one-size-fits-all government policy worked the same, across every community. Why would that ever be the case?
Yeah.
And de facto, if you're just doing a one-size thing, you can almost guarantee it will fail in probably approximately 2/3 of communities. Would be if you're asking me to estimate.
At least probably. I would say. You touched upon it, we discussed education a bit, and I'll talk a bit about an area I know you've been worked on very actively over the last few years, Justine, which is about business. The bridge from learning into earning, and the role business might most usefully play in nurturing social mobility, in growing those communities, in serving wider societal benefits and purposes, whether environmental or societal or whatever it might be. Can you say a bit about the work you've done on that and the importance you see, important role you see of business as kind of a conduit for social improvement, if you like?
I think it's essential. And unless business is strategically part of driving social mobility and equality of opportunity, it simply won't happen. And I think one of the failings of, say, Boris Johnson's government on levelling up was that it just became a towns fund.
Right.
When actually what it needed was really to pull in all the organisations that have the opportunities, which are, often business, for the most part, businesses. And so, in a sense, you were trying to get somewhere, but only with half of the system really able to kind of drive it. So the work that I do with businesses now, it falls into three categories really. The most important one is action. I want them to think strategically about how their opportunities change lives, how they can build talent pipelines into some of those communities, into some of those people that are more locked out from opportunity, not just because it's good for those communities, but all the evidence is it's good for business too.
Yeah.
And their employees, we value the fact that their companies are doing it. They get more and different thinking. They feel like they are part of an organisation that genuinely is having some positive impact. And I think the companies themselves, being able to do it better means they're more likely to succeed and win. I mean, who would you prefer to work for? A business that's really diverse in its talent, got all sorts of ideas coming into it, that knows how to progress that talent once it's got it, and that might mean you.
Yeah.
That's got leadership that understands this, or a business that doesn't. I know who I'm going to go to, but and therefore who is the business that's going to win? The one that gets all of that talent, or the one that talent thinks, I don't think I'll go there. I'm going to go to the better place.
Yeah.
So I see doing this as a race to the top for business, but in doing so, they become more productive. Why would you not want to be an employer that is getting the most out of your employees? There is no such thing in practice as a dead-end job.
Mm-hmm.
There's just an employer that has not worked out how to progress
right.
the people who are in those roles. When I started at what was then Pricewaterhouse, now PwC, I spent a year making a lot of cups of tea. I have to say I'm good at making mugs of tea. I was good at it at university, and I was good at it after university. I did a lot of photocopying back in the day. And, the only so that was a low-skilled role, arguably. But actually I was learning about business, I was learning about being in teams, I was learning about what auditing was all about. And the reason it wasn't a dead-end job was it was leading on to something else.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So it might have started off low-skilled, but it wasn't going to stay low-skilled. I had a path. That's the only difference. There's another version of PwC where that job is just done by the same person forever.
Right.
And that's what they do. And they bring someone else into the more senior roles that I ended up going into. That's just a choice of how the employer behaves. And that's why it's so important.
And so that makes perfect sense. But we also know, when we look at businesses across the piece, that many are still offering those dead-end, travelator, as distinct from escalator jobs to lots of people.
Mm-hmm.
We do know that businesses overall are spending less on training their staff, both than they were 20 years ago, and certainly relative to their competitors in the US or on the continent.
Mm-hmm.
So for them, for some reason, the penny hasn't yet dropped on the need to make that investment in the skills of their workforce, in providing a progression escalator. How do we shift that business system, do you think, Justine, to all that you say sounds completely compelling and begs the question, why does that not cut through to more businesses than it has so far?
I think there's the power of inertia. And maybe, Andy, British business is still overpopulated. by people who haven't had that journey,
Right.
don't believe that talent is spread evenly, and
Right.
think they kind of catapulted into the top through that short journey, connected journey, and so that's just because they're better. I don't know, maybe that's a harsh assessment, but what I would say is that unless we're able to get all of the pieces of the jigsaw in the right place, then the skills crisis we've already got will get worse. And I actually think, to be fair to business, I think a lot of businesses are thinking about this.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more work that goes on, and part of the work I talked about, the action piece, we also do advocacy and thought leadership, because there are a lot more solutions out there. Businesses don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's loads of companies doing great stuff. And I think certainly in Parliament and for policymakers, there's actually been quite a weak understanding of how much is happening. So yes, it's easy to focus on businesses that aren't doing this stuff. But actually, I think out of sight to a lot of us, there's a lot of great stuff going on. It is sort of becoming the social norm, and we're trying to mainstream it through publishing as much of our stuff, as we can, and we publish all of it, to try and inspire other companies to pick up some of these strategies and think, oh yeah, I could do that.
Yeah.
But it does have to change. And so if you think about it a bit like climate and sustainability, there was a time when 15, 20 years ago, a company having a sustainability plan would have felt a little bit odd. Now it's the norm, because actually we know that even for investors, you need to have a long-term plan, because the planet is changing, and so how are you going to keep your business model going in that different version of the world? But I think in the same way that companies have done their plans on planet, they now need to do them on people. And if the current talent crisis we're already in doesn't kind of make the penny drop, then maybe we'll just see the economy working as it does, which is weak leadership will be beaten by better leadership and better companies that can thrive in the world that we're now in and that we're moving into, where it's all about human capital and talent, and that's maybe the biggest shortage, that's the most important supply chain in the sense that companies need to obsess over.
And you mentioned earlier on that sometimes our systems need a jolt to change themselves.
Yes.
You mentioned Ebola on the international side and COVID everywhere, of course. Well, I think the world economy has just had a jolt, courtesy of Donald Trump. Do you think that could have the sort of galvanizing effect, the energizing effect among businesses, among politicians, to make those brave choices about shifting systems in all the ways you've described so elegantly?
Well, I did an expensive MBA that taught me that the answer to every question in life is it depends. So it depends, doesn't it? I think it depends whether the penny finally drops with anyone in our political systems that our problems are homegrown.
Right.
And they are around people not feeling like they're, in our case, in the US's case, these mature democracies are not creating opportunities that people want to see. There is, as far as I'm concerned, this implicit promise behind democracy, which is one person, one vote, drives and has a purpose of equality of opportunity. And that's a promise that's not been fulfilled. And so people are questioning what the point, in the sense of this system is, therefore. Because it's literally disenfranchising them. They keep voting and nothing changes.
Yeah.
And so the pressure, if you like, in our political systems, all of them, are from what's happening inside our countries. They're popping out in relation to our relationships with other countries. Because, of course, that is probably the easiest things for politicians to do, is to go, it's them over there. Right. They're the problem. But actually...
Which includes immigrants as well, by the way.
And that could... Maybe there's a bit of that's true. But the biggest issue
Is within.
is absolutely what's happening right here and right in the US, and communities that just have stopped believing that their prospects are ever going to get any better. And they are, I think, understandably, I talked about how I'd be angry now if I was growing up in Rotherham. They're understandably turning to ever more dramatic solutions to try and see if there's an answer out there. But I think the answers are homegrown. I think there are no silver bullets, but they are there. The good news, Andy, is that actually we could be, in our case, a version of Britain with equality of opportunity, or we could get a lot closer to that. We know how to do this. I've just spent the last Parliament out and about, hoovering up the solutions. You can see that businesses, I think, are really up for being part of this challenge and innovating.
Yeah.
We can do this, and actually we need to anyway, because we're a very socially stratified country. So we've probably got one of the biggest problems on weak social mobility. But actually the prize for me is equally, if we could redefine ourselves, then, I mean, that would really be, for a wider world, like a huge gift in a sense too, to be this country, perhaps with some of the most ingrained challenges around social mobility, that as a result of that was able to change itself, to confront them, to find the solutions for them. For me, that would be surely something we could be proud of as future generations look back on it.
Hard to think of a better endowment than that one. And we should wrap things up. A final question from me. I'm going to take you back to where we started.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take you back to Rotherham. And actually, I spent a day in Rotherham last year with local leaders.
Just at Disney Town Centre?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
with local leaders and local businesses talking about, as you know better than anyone, a place that's not just been laid low economically, but it's had its social problems as well.
Yes, yeah.
And some of those remain. Nonetheless, I came away from that, Justine, and I do this every time I travel around the country, which is a lot. I used to do a lot more, but I still do a fair bit, with a sense of optimism, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
I visited the new cinema and the bridge and how that's been thought about by the local council as a key piece of social infrastructure.
Yeah.
You mentioned giving blood. A cinema is another place where people come together collectively and have a degree of pride in place in some of the towns, the plans for the town. And of course, there's a long way to travel, and no one's remotely suggesting it's anything other than a steep trajectory from here. But nonetheless, the spirit was absolutely willing.
The Yorkshire grit.
The Yorkshire grit, and there was a sense of purpose, there was a sense of leadership, both governmental and civil society and business. And I wondered whether you shared that sense of optimism. Because if we can do it in Rotherham, we can do it in places all across the UK, right? And we all know there's huge amounts of latent potential, to your point from earlier on, in Rotherham and across the other parts of the UK that have fared less well than we would have liked for the last 50 years. Do you share that sense of optimism?
I absolutely do. I do, because when I first started, as I would put it in Cabinet, banging on about social mobility, I think, you know, to some extent it almost felt like it was my pet project, and not to me, but that's the sense, you know, that I just wanted us to debate, you know, policy around it a lot more. You know, I literally came up with the phrase levelling up because I wanted to refresh social mobility, and I felt probably we just needed a new name for it that would, you know, get some attention. But I think at the end of the day, you think about how much the conversation's moved on since then.
Yeah.
So at that stage, I don't think anyone had heard of levelling up. Now it went on top of the political agenda. Labour have got their breaking down barriers mission, quite rightly.
Yeah.
Different words, but the same aspiration and purpose. And I think we've crucially moved from a discussion around whether or not equality of opportunity should happen in Britain to how to do it.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge strategic shift, and I think when I look at what's happening in other countries, I think we're further ahead on that debate, and we recognise it's a debate that we're in. The challenge now for all of us, and that includes the political system, but particularly for business, civil society, and all of us, if you like, in the wider ecosystem, is working together to do it, and being really systematic about the solutions that we know work, and understanding how you can find them, spread them, learn from them, and then deliver them in a tailored way, but at scale. I don't see why we can't do that, actually, and because we can. Why not? You know, why wouldn't we do that? And so I think almost the last bit of the ecosystem, I think, that's going to snap into place and get its act together probably is the political bit. I think it's everyone else in Britain that's kind of ahead of our politics and already working on this and done lots of thinking about it. I think it's just a matter of time before, if you like, that innovation really gets plugged into a policy agenda. And I analogised it before to climate. I think in a sense what you need is to say, in the same way that you have a policy agenda that enables companies to get further faster on investing in climate and all of that, you need this policy agenda that is pro-social mobility to enable that wider ecosystem to just get on and do what it wants to do, which is to connect more people up to more opportunities, have more success, you know, and in doing so, lift a whole country.
Well, that's a fantastic way to end. Thank you, Justine, for, as ever, a deeply insightful and uplifting story about not just your story, but one for the whole country. So fantastic talking to you as ever.
Thanks, Andy.